Hannah stood on the shattered earth, her eyes fixed on the darkness that consumed the horizon. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and from the ruins rose a light bright and unnatural. She heard a voice, ancient as an echo. "You are no longer alone." In its words was a coldness, like death. Jesus was near. Syria, a land once filled with the echoes of ancient traditions and peaceful routines, had become a place of chaos and destruction. In the heart of this turmoil, there was a young woman named Hannah, born in the ancient city of Damascus, raised in a family that held faith and tradition above all else. Hannah had spent her childhood learning the importance of religion and the duties placed upon her. Her parents were strict, and every aspect of her life was governed by religious customs. She had learned to pray 5 times a day, memorized verses from the Quran, and understood her role as a daughter, a wife, and eventually a mother. The lines of her future were clear: serve her family, uphold the honor of her lineage, and never question the way of life handed down to her. Her father was a proud man, a symbol of the old ways. He spoke often of their family's legacy and the importance of maintaining their place in society. Hannah, ever the dutiful daughter, absorbed these teachings, though deep inside, she sometimes wondered what lay beyond the rigid structure of her life. There were moments, fleeting and difficult to acknowledge, when she yearned for something more, something beyond the expectations that clung to her like a second skin. But she kept her thoughts to herself, for such reflections were dangerous in her world. As the years passed, Hannah's life continued on its prescribed path. She followed the rituals, the prayers, the fasts, and the celebrations, each one marking her steady march through a life defined by tradition. Yet despite her outward devotion, an inner restlessness began to stir. She could not shake the feeling that there was more to life than what she was allowed to experience. There were nights when she would lie in bed, her thoughts drifting, wondering if there was another way to live, a different kind of life waiting for her beyond the walls of her family's home. But as the world outside her small circle of existence remained calm, so did Hannah's thoughts. She married as expected to a man chosen by her family. His name was Tariq, a respectable man, a doctor by trade, and someone her family deemed worthy of their lineage. He was kind enough, but the marriage was arranged, and the love Hannah longed for never blossomed. She tried to convince herself that love would come with time, but the love she was taught to cherish, the kind that emerged through submission, never materialized. Instead, she focused on fulfilling her duties as a wife, a role she had been prepared for since childhood. But then, the war began. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremor of an earthquake. News of distant skirmishes reached her, but life in Damascus continued. People prayed, worked, and tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. The first few bombs were shrugged off as unfortunate accidents, but soon it became clear that the war was coming closer. The days blurred into one another as violence, destruction, and fear seeped into every corner of the city. Hannah's world, once so familiar and secure, began to unravel. The sound of distant explosions became a constant backdrop to her life. Her family, like many others, tried to stay as safe as they could, but there was no escaping the inevitable. One day, a bomb fell not far from her home. The shockwave rattled the windows, and the sound of the blast was deafening. Hannah's world tilted, and for the first time, she felt truly vulnerable. She ran to the window and looked out, watching as the smoke billowed from the direction of the explosion. The ground beneath her felt unstable, as if it might swallow her whole. That was the moment when everything changed. That was the moment when her life, and the lives of everyone around her, were forever altered. Soon after, the violence reached her doorstep. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, and the streets themselves became dangerous, patrolled by soldiers, armed men, and militia. Hannah found herself trapped in her own home, a prisoner of her circumstances. It was no longer safe to walk the streets, to visit family, or to even go to the market. The once bustling streets of Damascus, filled with the sounds of laughter and music, were now silent, save for the occasional roar of warplanes flying overhead. Her home, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The walls that had witnessed her childhood now seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a nightmare from which there was no escape. She couldn't even find solace in her prayers. The familiar words of the Quran felt distant and hollow, as if the very earth beneath her had shifted, taking her faith with it. She tried to pray, but the words stuck in her throat, unable to find their way out. It was then, in the midst of the war, that she began to lose the people she loved. Her father, once a symbol of strength, was among the first to succumb to the war. One night, after a particularly violent bombardment, his body was found in the rubble of their home. The loss shattered Hannah's already fragile world. Her mother, once a pillar of grace and calm, fell ill from the shock of the events. She, too, was taken by the war, leaving Hannah feeling utterly alone. Tariq, her husband, was conscripted into the army and sent to the front lines. He, too, became just another casualty of the war. Hannah had no one left. Her family was gone. Her home was no longer a safe haven, and the very air seemed to carry the scent of death. Desperation clawed at her as she walked through the ruins of her city. She had seen too much. The destruction was incomprehensible. The people she had once known reduced to shadows of their former selves. She could not stay. She could not endure this nightmare any longer. There was only one option left: escape. But where to? What lay beyond the border? What would she find in the unknown? Hannah's decision was not made lightly. It was not a choice born of hope, but rather one born of survival. She packed a small bag with a few belongings. She could carry clothes, a little money, and a few pictures of her family. She left her home in the dead of night, walking through the streets she had once known, now filled with rubble and the stench of death. The city, which had once been her home, now felt like a distant memory, an echo of a life that could never be returned to. She made her way to the border, her steps slow but determined. Along the way, she saw others like her, people who had lost everything, people who were trying to escape the horror that had consumed their land. Some of them were walking, while others were crammed into overcrowded cars or makeshift trucks, all heading in the same direction, away from the violence, away from the destruction. They were refugees, displaced from their homes, searching for safety in a world that no longer seemed to care. Hannah's journey was long and fraught with danger. She crossed into Lebanon, then into Turkey, and finally found herself in a refugee camp, where she was just another nameless face among the thousands who sought shelter from the storm. It was a temporary refuge, but it was still better than the chaos she had left behind. But even in the camp, Hannah could not find peace. The horrors of war still haunted her, and the silence of the camp only deepened the emptiness in her heart. She was far from home, far from everything she had ever known. She was a stranger in a strange land, clinging to the hope that something, anything, would give her the strength to carry on. But what could she hope for when her life had been shattered beyond recognition? Hannah spent her days wandering the camp, her heart heavy with grief. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the stars above, feeling as though they were as distant as her former life. She no longer prayed as she once had. The words of the Quran no longer brought comfort. In their place, there was only a deep, aching emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she still clung to the faintest hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she would find a way to fill it. Hannah's journey to Turkey was a grueling and perilous one. From the moment she stepped beyond the ruins of her homeland, the path ahead was filled with hardship. The road was long, filled with obstacles that tested her physical endurance and emotional strength. It seemed that every step she took was one more in an endless cycle of struggle. The blistering sun beat down on her, and the weight of her meager belongings pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her water supply was limited, and there were moments when she felt as if her throat had turned to sand. The food was scarce, and often she would go days without a proper meal, surviving only on scraps she managed to scrounge from fellow refugees, or the occasional charity from strangers. Each day on the road stretched on endlessly, the landscape becoming monotonous, barren fields, dusty roads, and the occasional abandoned building, now nothing more than a skeleton of its former self. As Hannah walked, she could not escape the thoughts that haunted her, the memories of war, of destruction, of the family she had lost, and the life she had left behind. Each one was a weight on her heart. She had been taught her whole life that faith was her anchor, that prayer would protect her. But now, as she trudged through the desolate terrain, she could feel the very fabric of that faith beginning to unravel. It was not just the physical toll of the journey, it was the emotional and spiritual strain that threatened to overwhelm her. With every mile, she felt further from the life she had known, and further from the God she had once called upon for comfort. The border crossing into Turkey was no less harrowing. The fear of being caught by border guards was constant. The guards, often indifferent or hostile, would stop groups of refugees, questioning them, searching their belongings, and sometimes sending them back into the chaos they had escaped. Hannah, like so many others, knew that any misstep could mean being sent back to Syria to face the horrors she had barely managed to escape. The constant fear of being caught, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, gnawed at her. But even in the face of such fear, there was no turning back. Her resolve had hardened, not from hope, but from a desire to survive, to reach a place where she could, at the very least, catch her breath. One particularly brutal night, Hannah and several others were forced to take refuge in a small, dilapidated barn on the outskirts of a village. The cold was unbearable, and the barn offered little shelter from the biting wind. The group huddled together, trying to conserve warmth, but the dampness in the air seemed to seep into their bones. Hannah lay awake in the darkness, staring at the rough wooden beams above her, listening to the muffled sobs of the other refugees around her. It was in these moments of stillness that the weight of her isolation truly hit her. She felt as if she had been stripped of everything: her family, her faith, her identity. The life she had known was a distant memory, and in its place was only a crushing emptiness. She wondered if this emptiness would ever go away, or if it would follow her forever. The next day, the journey continued. The road to the refugee camp was long and treacherous, but at least there was the promise of some semblance of safety. When Hannah finally reached the camp in Turkey, she felt a momentary surge of relief. It was a place to rest, a place to find shelter. The camp was overcrowded, filled with people from every corner of the world. Some were Syrians like Hannah, others were from Afghanistan, Iraq, and even further afield. They all shared the same pain, the same fear, the same hope that they would find something better on the other side of this journey. The camp itself was a sprawling mass of tents, makeshift shelters, and dirt paths that wound through the dusty expanse. There were medical tents, food distribution areas, and rows upon rows of families huddled together, trying to survive. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and the faint scent of cooking food. People sat in clusters, talking in hushed tones, some trying to keep their spirits up with small acts of kindness, while others simply stared into space, lost in their thoughts. For a moment, Hannah allowed herself to believe that she had found a sanctuary. She was no longer running, no longer constantly on the move. She had a roof over her head, food to eat, and the bare necessities of life. But it didn't take long for the harsh reality of refugee life to sink in. The camp, though it offered safety, was also a place of suffocating limitations. The overcrowding created a sense of claustrophobia, and the constant noise, children crying, people talking, the sounds of daily survival, was overwhelming. There was no privacy, no space to be alone with her thoughts, and in the absence of these things, the isolation in Hannah's heart deepened. She had expected to find solace in the safety of the camp, but instead she found herself confronted with a growing sense of desolation. The camp was filled with people who had all suffered the same kind of loss, the same kind of trauma, but Hannah felt more alone than ever. The war had taken everything from her, and now, even in the relative peace of the camp, she couldn't escape the emptiness that gnawed at her insides. The people around her seemed to have found a way to survive, to carry on, but Hannah struggled to find meaning in any of it. The prayers she once held so dearly seemed distant, the words of the Quran lost their resonance in her heart. She no longer knew what to believe, or even if belief mattered. She spent her days walking through the camp, observing the people around her. Some of them had found ways to cope, helping each other, forming tight-knit communities, holding on to whatever faith they had left. Others were broken, their eyes hollow from the horrors they had witnessed. Hannah found herself drawn to the latter group, the ones who seemed to have given up on hope entirely. There was something in their defeat that mirrored her own sense of loss. She had tried to hold on to her faith, but the constant barrage of pain and loss had worn it down. She no longer knew who she was, or what she was supposed to believe. The hope she had once carried like a light in her heart had been extinguished at night. When the camp quieted down, Hannah would sit alone, staring at the stars. She missed her family terribly, and in the silence of the night, their faces would flash before her eyes. She wondered what they would have said if they could see her now lost, broken, struggling to hold on to something she no longer understood. In the stillness, she would pray, but the words felt hollow. She had nothing left to give, no belief strong enough to carry her forward. Her faith had been tested beyond its limits, and now, all that remained was the emptiness. Days turned into weeks, and Hannah continued to drift through life in the camp. She watched as others found their way, as they clung to their own beliefs, their own hopes. But Hannah could not find her own path. She was adrift, lost in a sea of uncertainty. It was in this deep void, in the quietest moments of despair, that something began to stir within her, something she could not explain, something she had long since abandoned. A whisper, a faint glimmer of something beyond the darkness, something that might offer the hope she so desperately needed. But for now, she could only wait, uncertain of what would come next. The day had started like any other in the refugee camp. Hannah, as part of a group of women, had gone to the nearby river with the others to collect water. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry, dusty ground. The camp, though teeming with people, felt strangely empty. The constant noise, the chatter, the cries of children had faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic sound of footsteps as Hannah and the others trudged toward the water. The river, which had once been a tranquil place, had become a lifeline. For the refugees, it was the only source of clean water for miles, and the women often made the journey multiple times a day. The air was thick with dust, and as the group reached the water's edge, Hannah knelt beside it, dipping the heavy container into the cool, clear liquid. The simple act, one she had done countless times in her life, now felt like a small reprieve from the endless cycle of survival. The river, however, was deceptive. What had seemed calm and steady moments before began to shift. The sky, once clear, turned dark and menacing. A gust of wind rattled the trees, and in the distance, the first growls of thunder echoed through the air. Hannah looked up in alarm, her hands still on the water's surface, and she felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The others, sensing the impending danger, stood up, their movements quickening with unease. Without warning, the storm broke. A torrent of rain poured from the heavens, almost instantly transforming the calm river into a violent rush of water. The wind howled, pushing the river's currents into a chaotic frenzy. Panic surged through the group as the water level began to rise rapidly. Women screamed, scrambling to gather their belongings and make their way back to the safety of the camp. But it was too late. The river, which had seemed so benign only moments ago, now roared with a force that was impossible to fight. Hannah found herself trapped in the rising current. The force of the water took her by surprise, knocking her off her feet. The world around her spun as the river swept her away, the water crashing against her body with such violence that it felt as though she were being torn apart. She struggled, her limbs flailing in a desperate attempt to grab hold of something, anything. But the water was too strong. It pulled her deeper, faster, until she could no longer feel the ground beneath her. The coldness of the water was overwhelming, and her breath became ragged as she gasped for air. Panic settled in her chest, tightening her throat, making it almost impossible to breathe. Her body, battered by the waves, felt as if it were being dragged into the abyss. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last as the current threatened to swallow her whole. She tried to scream, but the force of the water stifled any sound she made, leaving her trapped in a suffocating silence. Every inch of her body screamed for release, for respite from the cold and the pain. Her hands grasped at the water, her fingers slipping against the slick surface. It felt as though time had stretched infinitely, each second drawing her deeper into the unforgiving current. The world was a blur of rain, waves, and chaos. She couldn't hear anything except the rush of the water in her ears, nor could she see anything except the relentless flood of darkness that swallowed her vision. The ground she had once stood on, solid and sure, was now nothing but a distant memory, and all that remained was the suffocating grip of the river. In that moment, as fear surged within her, Hannah's mind seemed to shut down. Her thoughts, once full of questions and fears, began to fade into the background, replaced by the overwhelming urge to survive. But as her strength began to fade, she felt a deep sense of hopelessness. Her limbs were too weak, her body too cold, and her will to fight began to dissolve. She was certain that this was it, that the current would claim her life, just as it had claimed the lives of so many others before her. She let go, sinking deeper into the swirling darkness, her body surrendering to the inevitable. But just as she was about to succumb to the river's fury, something changed. The water, which had been dragging her under, suddenly released its grip. The relentless current, which had felt like an unbreakable chain, withdrew. For a brief moment, Hannah felt weightless, as if the water was no longer a threat. She blinked, struggling to comprehend the sudden shift. Had she imagined it? Was this simply a fleeting moment of respite before the inevitable came crashing down once more? It was then that she felt it, a presence. She couldn't explain it, couldn't name it, but something, or someone, was with her. The sensation was both foreign and familiar, as if a hand had reached out from the darkness and gently pulled her away from the brink. The force of the water that had threatened to drown her now seemed to recede, and she felt her body being lifted, held in the embrace of something greater than herself. Hannah's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since the storm began, she could see. The rushing water that had once been her enemy now seemed distant, as if she had been carried to a place of stillness amidst the chaos. She felt her feet touch something solid, something that grounded her, and she was pulled gently onto the shore. The storm raged on, but Hannah was no longer part of it. She lay on the wet ground, gasping for air, her body trembling from both fear and relief. The water, which had once threatened to claim her, now seemed to whirl away. As Hannah lay there, Her mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. She had been certain that she would die in the flood. The fear had consumed her, and yet she was alive. But how? Who had saved her? There had been no one visible, no one she could see through the blur of rain and water, and yet she had felt something, someone pulling her to safety. The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, but the experience had left an indelible mark on her soul, a mark that would change everything. In the moments that followed, Hannah remained on the ground, her body still shaking, her heart still pounding. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely process what had just happened, but deep within her, something had shifted. The terror of the river, the fear of death, had given way to something else, a spark of hope, a flicker of something she couldn't yet understand. It wasn't just that she had survived the flood, it was that something beyond her had intervened, something that she couldn't explain, something that seemed to defy all logic and reason. As the storm finally began to subside, Hannah slowly rose to her feet, her body sore and weak from the ordeal. She looked around, her eyes scanning the riverbank for any sign of those who had been with her, but the flood had taken them too. She was alone. The only sound now was the fading roar of the storm, and Hannah's own breath, ragged and uneven. But as she stood there, her mind still reeling from the encounter, one thing was clear: she was not the same. The river had tried to claim her, but something had stopped it. Something had reached into the chaos and pulled her out of the darkness. And as the water continued to recede, Hannah felt a strange warmth inside her, a warmth that felt like the first rays of the sun after a long, stormy night. Though she didn't understand it, the feeling remained, and with it, a new question arose in her heart. What had just happened? And more importantly, why had she been saved? The answers, for now, were beyond her reach. But one thing was certain: her journey had taken an unexpected turn, and she could never go back to the way things had been before. After Hannah managed to pull herself from the river's violent grasp, she stood there on the shore, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. The cold, aching body she had fought to free from the floodwaters was now still, as if time itself had frozen. She had been sure that her life would end, swallowed by the river that had taken so many others before her. Yet here she was, alive. The storm had raged, the water had risen, and yet someone had reached through the chaos and drawn her from its clutches. She couldn't see who or what had saved her, but the certainty that she had been rescued clung to her like the wet clothes on her back. As the night fell around her, bringing the silence that followed the storm, Hannah found herself alone with her thoughts. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, and yet in this vulnerability, something stirred inside her. The cold air bit at her skin, but her mind was on fire, consumed by the experience she couldn't explain. The water, the current, the moments when she thought it was over. How could she still be here? How could she be standing, breathing, when she had felt death's breath upon her? She moved through the refugee camp, her steps slow and uncertain, guided only by the dim light of a few distant lanterns. Her heart pounded, not from fear of her surroundings, but from the overwhelming need to understand what had just happened to her. She could hear the sounds of others in the camp, the murmurs, the crying children, the rustling of clothes in the cold. It was a familiar sound, but now it seemed distant, as if she were no longer a part of the world she had known. Hannah found a small, empty corner in one of the tents and collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling, her mind racing. The overwhelming thoughts continued to flood her consciousness, each question more pressing than the last. Who had saved her? Was it Allah, the one she had worshipped all her life? Or was it something or someone else for the first time? She felt a gap between her previous understanding of faith and the experience she had just endured. She had been raised with the belief that Allah was all-powerful, that He controlled everything. But now, as she sat there in the darkness, alone, she began to question everything she had ever been taught. The emptiness that had once clung to her heart, the emptiness that war had amplified, now seemed to fill with something else. It was not the calm certainty of her old faith, but a deeper yearning. She could no longer pray the way she once had. Her old prayers, the ones that echoed the words of the Quran, felt distant, robotic. They no longer had the same power, the same comfort they once provided. There was a longing for something more, something beyond the words of the verses she had memorized. And so, in the silence of the night, Hannah prayed again. But this time, her words were different. They came from somewhere deeper within her, somewhere raw and untamed. She didn't know to whom she was speaking, but she felt as if the words needed to be said. She didn't call upon Allah in the way she had learned to do. There was no formal structure to her prayer. There was only a desperate need to reach out, to ask for something she didn't know how to name. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. I don't understand. I don't know who you are, but I need help. Please show me. Show me the way." It was not a request born of understanding, but of surrender. She didn't know what she was asking for, but she knew that in that moment, the emptiness within her could not be filled by the prayers she had always known. Something new had to come, something that could make sense of the feeling inside her, something that could explain the presence that had pulled her from the river in the darkness. As she sat on the cold ground, she closed her eyes, waiting for something to change. The wind outside the tent stirred, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth. She breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, and yet, there was a feeling that something was about to happen. It wasn't the kind of feeling she had experienced during moments of intense prayer. Before, this was different. This was something new. She didn't know what to expect, but her heart began to beat faster, and a warmth began to spread through her chest. It was not warmth from the air or from her tired body, it was a fire inside her. Something she couldn't explain. Something that felt both comforting and terrifying at the same time. As Hannah sat there, wrapped in her thoughts and prayers, the fire inside her seemed to intensify. It was as if her very soul was being stirred, as if the world around her was beginning to change. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the certainty of her experience, the feeling that someone had saved her, grew stronger. She hadn't seen the hand that had pulled her from the flood, but she felt its presence like a shadow over her. She felt it like a hand on her shoulder, a breath on her neck. The flames of her inner turmoil and longing seemed to burst into something tangible, a heat that moved through her, slowly but powerfully. In that moment, her entire being was consumed by something that felt like both a cleansing and a burning. It wasn't the destruction of her faith, but the beginning of something new, something she had never known before. The fire, though intense, didn't scorch her. Instead, it refined her, shaped her. Hannah didn't know it yet, but that night, in the solitude of her corner in the refugee camp, her soul had been awakened. The questions that had haunted her now had the space to breathe. The doubts, the confusion, the yearning, they were no longer burdens, but the beginning of a journey that would take her beyond everything she had ever known. She didn't know who or what had saved her from the river, but she knew that this presence, this feeling of warmth and fire, was leading her somewhere. It was calling her, gently but firmly, towards something greater than herself, something that she would soon discover was more than she could ever have imagined. And as the night wore on, Hannah knew that her life had been irrevocably altered. Her faith, which had once been so firm and unquestioning, was now something fluid, something open, ready to be shaped by a force she had yet to fully understand. In the silence, with the fire in her heart and the storm outside fading into the distance, Hannah whispered again. But this time, the words were different. They were words of surrender, words of faith that she hadn't yet understood but knew she would in time. "I trust you," she whispered. "I don't know who you are, but I trust you." And in that moment, something shifted, as if the very air around her had changed. The world was still dark, still uncertain, but Hannah was no longer afraid. The fire in her heart was warm, and it was just the beginning. The next day, after the storm had subsided, Hannah woke to a world that felt different. The air was still heavy with the remnants of the rain, but there was a shift in her heart, a subtle yet undeniable change that she couldn't quite explain. As she sat up in the small, dimly lit corner of the refugee camp, she felt something she had never felt before, a sense of peace. It was a deep, abiding calm that seemed to fill every corner of her being, pushing out the fear, the emptiness, and the pain that had dominated her life for so long. Her body still ached from the ordeal in the river, but there was a clarity in her mind, a sense of quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. As she looked around the camp, everything appeared the same: the tents, the makeshift shelters, the refugees moving about their daily routines, but Hannah saw it through new eyes. The grayness of her existence, the endless cycle of survival, seemed to recede into the background, as if it no longer defined her. There was something else now, something greater, something that had been awakened in her. She could still feel the warmth in her chest, the same warmth that had filled her when the unseen presence had pulled her from the river. It was as if that moment had marked the beginning of a new life, a life she had yet to fully comprehend, but could already feel stirring within her. The figures she had felt in the water lingered in her mind. It was not an image of a person she could see with her eyes, but a sensation that had been far more real than anything she had ever known. She remembered the warmth, the light that had surrounded her, and the undeniable sense of safety that had wrapped around her like a protective shield. It wasn't something she could explain with words, but it was as though the divine had reached into the chaos of her life and touched her in a way that left her forever changed. That presence had been something she had never encountered before: a love, that was beyond her understanding, a love that had saved her when she had no hope left. Hannah's mind began to explore these thoughts with a quiet urgency. She had always been taught that Allah was the only path, the only way. Yet, in that moment of quiet reflection, she began to question what she had always known. The peace she felt in her heart seemed to be at odds with everything she had been taught. It was a peace that had no explanation, a peace that had come not through her own efforts, but through something far greater than her. It was then that she met a group of Christians in the camp, volunteers who were there to help the refugees. They were kind, gentle, and filled with the joy that seemed out of place in such a desperate environment. There was something different about them, something that drew Hannah in. She had seen them before, helping with food, organizing supplies, offering assistance to those in need, but now she found herself seeking them out, feeling a strange pull toward them that she couldn't deny. They were nothing like the people she had been raised to fear. They spoke with compassion, with love, and their words were filled with a sincerity that Hannah couldn't ignore. One of the women, an older volunteer with gentle eyes, approached Hannah. One day as she sat by the campfire, she sat down beside her and began to speak softly about her own journey. She told Hannah about the power of prayer, about Jesus and the miracles that had changed her life. Hannah listened intently, her heart stirring with an unfamiliar sense of curiosity. The woman spoke of God's love, of how He had reached into her life and transformed her in ways she never thought possible. There was a quiet conviction in her words, a peace that Hannah couldn't deny. This woman had something Hannah wanted, something that seemed to fill the emptiness in her soul. After some time, the woman invited Hannah to read some Christian testimonies, to watch videos of people who had experienced miraculous encounters with God. Hannah hesitated at first, unsure of what to expect, but something inside her urged her to take the first step. She had nothing left to lose. She began to watch the testimonies, to read the books, and what she found shook her to the core. The stories were filled with accounts of people who had encountered God in the most profound ways. People who had experienced healing, miracles, and transformations that defied explanation. These were stories of people who had found Jesus and, in doing so, had found a love and peace they had never known. Hannah couldn't stop reading. The more she learned, the more she felt the stirrings of something deep within her, a feeling of recognition, of truth. The testimonies were not just stories to her. They were windows into a reality she had never considered. She read about how people had prayed to Jesus in moments of desperation, and how He had answered them in ways they never expected. There were stories of people who had felt lost, just as she had, and who had been found by Jesus in the most unexpected places. As she read, Hannah's heart began to soften. The walls she had built around herself, the walls of fear, anger, and confusion, started to crumble. In the days that followed, Hannah spent hours watching videos, reading testimonies, and reflecting on what she had learned. The more she learned about Jesus, the more her heart opened. There was a peace that came with each story, each account of someone finding hope and love in Jesus. Her mind, once clouded with doubt and confusion, began to clear. It was as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes, and she could finally see the path that had always been there, waiting for her to take the first step. As Hannah's understanding grew, so did her faith. She no longer felt lost or alone. She had found something that filled the emptiness within her, a relationship with Jesus, a connection that transcended the rigid religious structures she had once known. Her heart was no longer burdened by the weight of doubt, but was instead filled with a lightness, a joy that had eluded her for so long. The peace she had felt on that fateful night in the river was now more than just a fleeting moment. It was a reality, a truth that she could hold on to. Hannah's transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. There were moments of fear and doubt, moments when the old ways of thinking crept back into her mind, trying to pull her back into the darkness. But with each passing day, she grew stronger in her faith. She began to pray. But now her prayers were different. They were personal, intimate, and filled with a deep sense of connection. She no longer felt as though she were speaking to a distant God, but to a God who knew her, who understood her, and who loved her unconditionally. The other refugees in the camp noticed the change in her. They saw the light in her eyes, the calmness in her demeanor, and the peace that seemed to surround her. Some of them were curious, asking her questions about her newfound faith, while others were skeptical. But Hannah no longer cared what others thought. She had found something far more important than the approval of those around her. She had found truth, and it was enough. As the days passed, Hannah began to share her story with others. She told them about the river, about the presence that had saved her, and about the love she had found in Jesus. Some listened with interest, others with skepticism. But Hannah knew that her journey was only beginning. She had been transformed not by her circumstances, but by the love of God. and she was ready to follow wherever that love would lead her. In the quiet of the refugee camp, amidst the chaos and uncertainty of the world around her, Hannah had found peace. It was not the peace that came from escaping her past or from fleeing the horrors of war. It was the peace that came from knowing she was loved, that she was not alone, and that she was no longer defined by her circumstances. Her faith in Jesus had transformed her, and with that transformation, she knew her life would never be the same again. One evening, as the camp sank once again into its familiar quiet, Hannah found herself alone. The fading sounds of distant conversations and the low murmur of the wind were the only company she had. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the tents and makeshift shelters. The cold of the night seeped into the air, but Hannah didn't notice. She had become accustomed to the uncertainty of life in the camp, the ebb and flow of emotions, and the ever-present fear of what the next day would bring. But tonight was different. Tonight, she could not escape the weight of the thoughts and feelings that had been building within her over the past few weeks. She remembered all that she had been through: the war, the escape, the uncertainty, and most of all, the overwhelming experience that had come during the storm, the river, the cold, the terror, and the warm, invisible presence that had saved her. She remembered the light that had filled her when she thought all was lost, and the peace that had followed. Her heart had been heavy with questions for so long, but now, in the stillness of the night, those questions were beginning to find answers. Hannah sat on the ground beneath the makeshift shelter she called home. Her hands folded in her lap, she could still feel the stirrings of something within her, a quiet yet persistent longing. It was a longing that had begun the night she was pulled from the river, a longing that had only deepened as she spent more time with the volunteers in the camp. She had heard stories, watched testimonies, and read words that spoke to her in ways she had never imagined. But despite everything she had experienced, there was still fear. Fear of what this new belief might cost her. Fear of the repercussions of accepting something so radically different from everything she had been taught. She had been raised in a world where to embrace any faith but Islam was unthinkable, where to question the teachings of the Quran was a sin punishable by death. She had always known that a step beyond her faith would be a step towards something dangerous, something that could separate her from everything she had known, her family, her past, her identity. To accept Jesus into her heart meant to accept a new path, one that would alienate her from her own people, her own traditions, and her entire world. But in that moment, the fear began to melt away, and a new understanding emerged. It wasn't about rejecting her past. It was about finding a truth that transcended it, a truth that was more than the circumstances she had been born into, more than the faith she had been raised in. She had come to a quiet realization: she had not been saved by the storm or by mere chance. No, it was something greater. The moment she had been pulled from the water, the presence that had surrounded her wasn't just a comforting light. It was a sign that her life was meant for more. She had felt it then, and she felt it now: the love, the peace, the security of knowing that someone had always been watching over her, even when she hadn't known it. It was not a fleeting feeling, but a profound truth. And now, more than ever, she needed to accept it fully. With a deep breath, Hannah slowly knelt on the cold ground, her body trembling slightly with the weight of what she was about to do. She had fought this moment for so long, fought the voice inside her that urged her to surrender, to trust. But now, there was no turning back. She knew what she had to do. She closed her eyes and lowered her head in reverence, the words that had been bubbling up inside her finally spilling out. "I believe in you, Jesus. You saved me when I thought all was lost. I don't know why you chose me, but I am ready to follow you now." As the words left her lips, her heart felt as though it were going to burst. A wave of warmth flooded through her body, a sensation that she couldn't explain. It wasn't the warmth of the night or the heat of the campfire. It was something far deeper. It was a love that washed over her, enveloping her, filling every corner of her heart with peace. It was the same peace she had felt that night in the river, the same peace that had started her on this journey of transformation. In that moment, Hannah knew that her life would never be the same. The burden she had carried for so long, the emptiness, the loneliness, the pain began to lift. It didn't disappear all at once, but it no longer controlled her. Her past no longer defined her. It had been replaced by a new reality, one rooted in love and grace. She wasn't just a refugee anymore, a woman lost in the chaos of war and displacement. She was a daughter of God. Hannah sat there for a long time, her hands clasped together. In silent prayer, the world around her continued to move: the sounds of the camp, the cries of children, the murmurs of refugees. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Hannah felt at peace. She didn't know what the future held, She didn't know how she would navigate this new path, or what challenges lay ahead. But she knew this. She was no longer alone. She had found something new, someone who would walk with her through it all. As the night stretched on and the stars began to appear in the sky, Hannah stood up slowly, feeling a strength she hadn't known before. The change in her was not outward. It was in the way she carried herself, in the way her heart beat with new purpose. Her faith, once fragile and uncertain, was now solidified. She had made the choice to follow Jesus, and nothing could take that from her. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The days that followed were filled with a quiet confidence. Hannah continued to pray, but now her prayers were different. She spoke with Jesus as though he were sitting right beside her. Her words not just recitations, but expressions of her heart. She began to read the Bible with a newfound hunger, drawing from the words not just stories, but life itself. She found comfort in the Psalms, strength in the teachings of Jesus, and a deeper understanding of her own journey. As she moved through the camp, helping others as best as she could, Hannah noticed a change in the way people looked at her. The light that now shone from within her was something they couldn't ignore. Some came to her, asking about her newfound faith, curious about the change they saw in her. Others kept their distance, unsure of what to make of it. But Hannah didn't mind. She knew that her journey was her own, and though others might question it, she had found the truth that would sustain her. One evening, as she sat by the fire with a few others, a woman approached her. She had heard the rumors, the whispers of Hannah's transformation, and she was curious. Hannah smiled softly, her heart full of compassion. She could see the same emptiness in the woman's eyes that she had once felt. With gentle words, she shared her story of the river, of the presence she had felt, and of the peace she had found in Jesus. The woman listened intently, her expression changing as the words sank in. Hannah knew that, like her, this woman was searching for something more, something deeper. In the days that followed, Hannah continued to share her faith with others, never forcing it, but always offering it freely. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. She would face opposition, misunderstanding, and possibly danger. But with Jesus by her side, she was no longer afraid. She had accepted the faith, and in doing so, she had found the courage to live it openly. Her life in the camp was far from easy. The challenges of being a refugee, of living in the midst of war and uncertainty, were still there. But now, she had hope, she had a purpose, and above all, she had a love that would carry her through the hardest of times. No longer was she defined by her circumstances. She was defined by the love of God, a love that could not be shaken by anything in this world. Hannah's acceptance of faith was not the end of her journey, it was the beginning. A beginning that would take her to places she could never have imagined, a journey of healing, restoration, and purpose. She had made her decision, and though the path ahead would be difficult, she was no longer afraid. With Jesus, she knew she could face anything.